Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, so it's good to see your beautiful faces today. I feel like the title of my talk is very shitty because it doesn't provide enough individual context on what I'm talking about. And while I was chatting with the organizers and trying to understand what the audience persona looked like last week, I sort of tweaked the workshop a bit. I wanted to like do a 1 hour workshop on something called Postman Notebooks, which is a way to document interactive APIs, and I sort of took that a little. But anyway, my name is Gbadebo. You can call me Debo. Everyone calls me Debo. I work as a developer advocate at Postman, and what that means is I get to talk random things about the products to developers and talk their ears off. But on a more serious note, what that really means is I get to advocate for the products, do a lot of developer education, and understand how people are using the product on day to day and how that translates into our product roadmap. Get to interact with a lot of the product teams to understand how we are communicating a lot of these things to developers. So, yeah, when I say 80% of my time is spent yapping to developers, I believe I'm not wrong. Um, but yeah, I'm a community person at heart. I do a lot of community development. Like you mentioned, I'm one of the organizers of API Conference Lagos, which is an API-focused community here in Lagos, where we do like a yearly event, a conference like this one, and other smaller events. But yeah, let's just get right into it. So one of the things I really want to like talk about today is how AI has changed the way in which developers are consuming content. And that's because in a lot of the things that I do in my role, which includes yapping to developers, um, I always find new ways to teach developers how to use our products, how to use the latest developer tools. And developers are always looking for new ways in which they want to experience new tools that they can try out and new tools that they can make use of. So first of all, I see myself as a developer advocate, as a teacher, where we teach people via like different content formats, recorded videos, conference talks, documentation, speaking in person with people, trying to understand how they're using like the product. And one of the things that we figured is that the way in which content is consumed by developers has changed over the years. And if you look at 4 years ago, for example, if you want to learn about a new topic, the first thing you do is perhaps a Google search. If you are writing code and you're stuck and you want to learn how to fix a bug, you perhaps would end up on Stack Overflow and maybe read a couple of blog articles. But we see that that has changed over the years. And today, before I go to Google to search for something, I'm probably on ChatGPT asking it specific questions about that thing. Or maybe because I've moved from using VS Code to using Cursor, I ask the Cursor agent to explain that specific thing to me before I even leave the current environment I'm in where I'm writing that code. So the way developers are experiencing content is changing. Developers are not just going to your documentation anymore to read it. They're also experiencing it via different AI agent and LLM systems that exist. And previously, the first question that someone would ask is, where's your API documentation, for example? But these days, they ask very specific question, how do I build X? And at times, the API documentation is perhaps maybe not the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of developers. So in DevRel, some of the metrics that we used to focus on previously were like, I mean, this is just like very vague, but some of the things that we used to focus on previously, like how many views were our page getting, we still focus on these things, right? What is our blog traffic like? How are people utilizing our documentation, and how many people is actually reading our documentation? How are people engaging on our public discussion channels like Discord and Discourse? While a lot of these metrics are still very much relevant today, we figured that it doesn't tell the whole story about how developers are actually engaging with our content, because developers are beginning to engage with like the content that we're putting up outside of our platform. So they are no longer alone. They are now building with AI agents, interacting with like LLMs. And these LLMs are able to like do things like read documentations, test your API, or even generate code. So I gave an example of Cursor, for example, because I use Cursor a lot. Maybe that's why it's coming up in a lot of my examples. But I use Cursor to like write code or do AI-assisted programming, where it's able to like generate code for me And at times, it has access to like different tools. There's like the browser use tool, there's like the search tool. And a lot of times when it doesn't know how to do stuff, it goes out to read the documentation and comes back with like a code on how to do that specific thing. Ideally, if I wanted to do that, I would have gone to like the documentation myself, read the documentation, try to understand and get specific information from the documentation before I implement what it is that I want to do. But the agent is able to like do that and outsource that for me and tell me exactly what it finds. So imagine you have like an API that does X and you want to write an implementation for that API. And the way in which you're discovering how to write that implementation is via chatting with an AI agent rather than actually reading the documentation. So if you're someone writing the documentation, for example, you need to care about how not just humans are discovering the contents, but how machines are also discovering the contents that you are putting out. So the new audience that we have for a lot of the content we are authoring as people who author like technical documentation or whatnot is not just tailored for humans anymore. You have to tailor it for machines. And you have to think about the two ways in which people discover these products, like discover like a documentation. Either the LLM model is already trained on this content and it has like this in its training data, or it's able to source for the information when it needs it. So these are like the two primary ways in which like any agentic system discovers like new content. And one thing that is uniform, even though there's like a lot of similarities between how humans and machines learn, is that both of them need clarity, they need context, and they need structure. So even if I was telling someone to perform a task for me, if there's no clarity, if there's no structure, if I'm not giving the appropriate context, the person wouldn't have to the full extent of what they need to actually perform that specific task. And similarly, for an agentic system, if you do not provide all of these things, they won't be able to get what they need to do done. So given that I've set like the basis for understanding that there's a new class of content consumers, and it's not just developers, it's developers and AI agent and LLM systems. How do we then optimize for the LLM era? Which is primarily what a lot of like the demo and workshop side of things that I'm going to be doing today is going to like show. So I know perhaps everybody was at the panel session, but I told like a very brief story of something that we did at Postman a couple of years back, which is called All-Star Postman, where we're trying to like author like different content to target like specific SEO keywords. And that was like widely very successful. AI would have really helped us do that a lot better. But over the years, we figured that we're getting more and more traffic to our documentation and all of our products landing pages from different LLM providers, ChatGPT, Gemini, Cloud, different agentic systems. And it was so much that I think right now, behind Google search, which still remains largely number one, LLMs are by far the largest way in which people discover our documentation. And that's got us thinking, if people are really discovering our content via interaction with LLMs and AI agents, how do we make this discoverability even better? I mean, if it were humans like discovering, we'd think about SEO optimization, right? But for LLM discoverability, what do we think about? And this brought about like generative engine optimization, which is like a new terminology that is going around. And just very high level overview of some of the things that we did to just improve how this discoverability is happening is we may be doing things like improving our site maps, for example. These things already existed before, right? And it's like best practice to have like really structured, proper site maps. But we're able to like improve our site maps in XML to cater for the fact that not just humans are going to be using the site maps, but LLMs are going to be discovering it either when they're trying to search for information or when they're trying to like gather data for training. Optimizing things like our navigation system for our documentation using specific standards, like schema.org provides a very interesting and nice standards for navigating like web pages for LLMs, and our documentation follows that standard. Then one other thing that we talked about at the panel session, I think one other guy came up and mentioned LLMs.txt, which is very similar to robots.txt. And I can actually show this. Let me stop sharing. If I go to postman.com/docs today, This really directs to our documentation, which is our learning center. And if I do /llms.txt, for example, you see this text that is here. And what this text is we know the AI agent or the LLMs are going to come to get information from our website. So if you use ChatGPT and ChatGPT is trying to search for something on the internet, it usually tries to do it very quickly, right? There's usually like a 5-second or 10 seconds timeout. So even though it is reading multiple pages, there's so much it can read within that time frame where it has to actually search, unless you're using deep search, for example, because it doesn't want to keep you hanging for getting a response. So we know that LLMs are going to come to our websites to search for content. And this is just a way of we telling the LLM that, hi, alpha. Now this seems like a very basic example, but it expands into something called RAG, which means retrieval augmented generation. And what that simply means is we're able to provide necessary context to an AI agent, similar to how I'm providing a context on the side here, by giving it access to a knowledge base, which is a pool of different knowledge that it can get relevant information from. And just to show that in example, let's say I, as a publisher of an API documentation, for example, I want to provide like a knowledge base to people who are consuming my API documentation. How do I go about solving that problem? So what I built here is, let me restart this server. So what I built here is an AI agent. You could literally give it a documentation of any API, the URL of any API documentation, and it's going to autonomously peruse that API documentation itself. Let me do something different. Let me do a documentation that I had not done before, because I think I've done. So I could give it Paystack's API documentation, for example. And when I click on generate documentation, what this does is it spins up a browser here, and the agent autonomously controls the browser. And you perhaps see it navigating and clicking things. Of course, my hands are up, so I'm not really doing anything here. But after a while, you see that the agent starts to like peruse this API documentation itself, and starts to like read through the content of the API documentation to get relevant information. And as it is perusing the API documentation, it is streaming all of that information back to like the client side here, where I'm able to like see the activity it's taking, when it takes a screenshot, when it takes a browser action and clicks on something, the number of reasoning steps that it has. I'm just waiting for it to take an action. Usually it doesn't take this long, but I think the internet is not great. Okay, like that wasn't me doing stuff. You can see that it's scrolling through like the page and taking like different actions on the page. And what it does is it's reading this documentation and generating something called embeddings for the documentation. And embeddings is just a vectorized data where it's able to map text as numbers and store it in something called a vector database. So it's able to generate embeddings for what is seen on the documentation, store it in a vector database. And because it's stored in a vector database is very good for something called a similarity search. So think of how we like query data from databases today. We do like a keyword search, for example. If I'm searching for cats, it's going to match everything that has like the cat keyword. But for a vector database, if I'm searching for cats, it perhaps would return kitten, because kitten is very similar to cat. So even though the keywords are not matching, they're like very similar, and it does that. So think here, because the AI agent is reading the documentation on my behalf, and is getting all the relevant information I need from the documentation, I could see what part of the documentation the AI agent has read. I could see that it has read maybe the HTTP methods, for example, because that's how far it has gone. And I can ask it, what can you tell me about the HTTP methods, this documentation support? Um, I think I have like a couple of typos. Let's try that again. Okay, great. So now I see that I'm able to like interact with like an LLM or an AI agent. And this AI agent was not trained on this documentation's data. What is really happening here is because the agent is able to like scrape relevant information about the documentation and store it in a knowledge base. It's when I ask it specific question, it's searching its knowledge base for the relevant keywords, getting things that are very similar to that and giving me the response back. So if I search for something that it doesn't know in the documentation, for example, I see that it hasn't gotten to like transactions, for example, and I ask it, how do I, and you can still see that it's still like scrolling through like the page and performing actions. So if I ask it something like, how do I initiate a transaction? You see that it doesn't have contextual information to answer that specific questions because it has not experienced that part of the documentation yet. But what this does is when it's done generating, it's generated a Postman collection for me. And the Postman, this was from the time that I ran this before, the Postman collection looks exactly like this in JSON. So I can go ahead in Postman and import this collection, but I'm not going to import it. I've done this previously. And when I did import this collection the previous time, you can see that this includes a complete documentation for that documentation. Documentation for documentation. That sounds weird to say. But it includes a complete documentation for that documentation in Postman, which means you can then bring the power of Postman to your APIs. You have a documentation on your website and you want your team to collaborate within Postman on the APIs as they're developing it. And this agent just takes the URL, automatically peruses the entire web page by itself autonomously, generates a documentation that you can start with within the Postman platform. But let's see how this really helps you. So let me come here. I have this chat request because the agent is exposing like different API endpoints. And this chat request is like the request that the agent is using on the UI when I chat with it here. So I've exposed this as something called an MCP server. And earlier on, I explained that MCP are ways in which you're able to expose tools to LLMs with a standardized format, and they're able to decide and pick from those specific tools to perform specific actions. So in here, this is something called agent mode in Postman. And agent mode is basically an agent that allows you to do anything that you can do within the Postman UI. And it's by far one of the ways in which developers interact with our documentation at Postman. When people are within the product and they want to learn how to do specific things within the product, we do not expect that they go to the documentation every time to read. At times, they should just be able to ask agents mode how to do specific things, and agents mode is able to provide that specific information. Now, the problem with I wouldn't say problem, but the problem with any agentic system is it is only aware of the context in which it has been trained on, right? It's not aware of external context. So agent mode knows Postman in and out. But if I, as someone publishing an API on Postman, or publishing my documentation on Postman, want to ask agent mode specific questions about my API documentation, it might not be able to give that specific context, especially if that data has not been something it has experienced in its training. So with this now, I'm able to expose an MCP server, and I've configured an MCP tool here that I'm using. Here, there are different tools that I'm exposing, but I'm only checking the knowledge base one. So I could ask it very specific questions. For example, if I come to this chat window, I could see that the documentation I'm working with here is the Paddle API documentation, and I can ask it, how do I work with pricing information on Paddle? And for context, Paddle provides API endpoints where you can get pricing related information. And it's able to answer this question because it has access to because it has access to like the knowledge base and it's able to like query that specific endpoint to get the relevant information it needs. I'd already connected this before, but if I started like a new chat window and I ask it that same question, you'd see it make an API call to the knowledge base. Let's do this. And that knowledge base is using this search knowledge base endpoint, where it's doing like a similarity search and it's returning an array of things that are similar to like the query that I'm searching for. And you can see that because it's able to get the relevant information, I can tell it to create that API request. I can tell it to create the API request in this collection. And it's creating that request, is requesting for like my approval. If all of this look good, I can approve. And now before this, agents mode didn't know anything about like Paddle APIs or the documentation. But because I've been able to generate a knowledge base for my documentation, it means that if I have 1 million developers using my product, they now have access to a knowledge base and a tool that they can connect within any AI agentic system that they are using that provides them contextual information about that documentation itself. So in this case, I'm using it in agent mode in Postman, but I could use it anywhere. I could use an MCP server. So a lot of the coding agents that we have today, Cursor, or the new anti-gravity that Google just released yesterday that is shaking everywhere, should be able to connect to an MCP server and actually get contextual information and do things. So going back to the slides, the other thing I want to show is that developers like to learn by doing stuff, which is why tutorials are like a very popular content format that people use to augment their already existing API documentation. So if you have like an API documentation, people offer like tutorials and walkthroughs of these API documentations on how to do things. So people want to get working examples with minimal errors and get like fast feedback loops on how they can get to that joyous moments when they're using your APIs. And this was one of the reasons why we built something called Postman Notebooks. And Postman Notebooks are just interactive API documentations that you can use. And I think the best way to talk about notebooks in Postman is by showing what it is. So let's assume I want to get started. I'm a complete newbie. I'd never seen the Postman API documentation before. And I wanted to get started working with Postman. Now I could either go to the Postman API documentation, or I could use a notebook that has already been created by Postman that helps me get started with the Postman API documentation. And this is just one very interesting use case. And on reading this, it tells me the Postman Powerful API, what it does for API collaboration, how to use it. It's giving me a couple of prerequisites. I need a Postman account. I need to understand REST APIs. I need the desktop or web app, and I also need the API key. And for a lot of APIs that you're going to be writing about or documenting, there needs to be some form of authentication or authorization that exists for these APIs. And the first thing I would do here is to click on this Generate an API Key button, which just takes me to a page where I can generate an API key. But I think I already did this because I don't want to, I did not do that. But no worries, this would be deactivated as fast as. So I go ahead and generate an API key, and I'm not just reading the documentation. I'm seeing that there's a place in which I can input that API key itself. So I go ahead and paste the API key there, and it's telling me the structure of authorization that it uses. Able to see that it uses like this XAPI key authorization form, and this API key that I use looks like this is some sort of variable. I mean, at this point, I don't know what that is yet. But just reading on this documentation, I can see that there are more input fields where there's the base URL, and I see that there's this thing that looks like how you'd typically run a request in Postman. And this request here reads like get workspaces, so I can send this request and see what it gets me. And I see it's taking two variables. It's taking API key variable, it's taking the base URL, and just by running that API request, I'm able to immediately see the response. Now, how long did it take me to go from not knowing anything about Postman API to getting my first 200 OK? If I was exploring the API documentation myself and trying to like What is the base URL? Where do I get the API key? What's the first request I should run as someone just experiencing this API for the first time? It's going to take me significantly longer time to do all of those things. But because everything is already outlined here in a notebook, I literally just copied and pasted the API key, then sent the request, and I got a 200 OK. And I see this is getting all the workspaces that I have access to on Postman. And I'm like, cool, okay, that looks interesting. And I see there's also this block here that has some code, and it looks like a visualization code. I can see some markdown in HTML, and this is looking like React code. So if I run this, so I'm actually going to go back and explain what each of these different things is. So if I run this, I'm able to like see a visual representation of all of the workspaces that I just got. So now what's really happening here is this block here runs this API request, and I get a response from this API request in the same documentation, but the response of this block is available as a variable, and that response of this block is being used in the next block, which is a code execution block. We call it the code runner block, which is able to run a bunch of JavaScript code, including React code or any other framework that you choose to use. And running this, I'm able to visualize that data. So I'm new to this API. I've never worked with it. And my first time interacting with it, I'm not just saying JSON. I'm also saying a UI that's actually representing the data in a way that would make sense to me. So yeah, I could see that there's a UI, there's like different workspaces, and all of the workspaces here, we use them for like demos, so you find like a lot of demo stuff here. So I could search for specific things I could do. I could search for demo, for example. I expected to figure this out. I'm not sure the filter, well, I'm not sure the filter stuff is working. That was working while I was testing, but it does. Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay, that's interesting. I thought it wasn't working. Because at times things happen when you're trying to like do demos and they don't go exactly as you planned. And you're like, are the demo gods on my side today? But anyway, I'm glad it works. So you can see that there's a visual representation. So if I was going through this API, for example, and I get this long, exhaustive list of JSON, I could understand this JSON, but with a visual representation, it makes more sense to me as someone trying to consume this API documentation of what this would look like on a UI. So going over the documentation, I can see that there's like a bunch of other things. There's also this code runner block here, which is also trying to explain the step-by-step workflow of this tutorial. And you start by creating a workspace, you create and update the collection, then you add and modify a request, which is the onboarding flow that we are going through this documentation itself. And there's this nice, this was just a nice to have, and this was AI generated, by the way. I did not write this code myself. So the AI felt it was nice to have a vertical layout, and it added it, and I kept it. But anyways, if I wanted to like see the logs, if I logged something, I could see the logs as well. But going through the documentation itself, I could see that the first step is me actually showing me how to create a workspace. And I'm reading this, I'm saying, oh, there's 3 different types of workspaces in Postman. There's the internal, there's the partner, there's the public workspace. And it's asking me for some data. What do I want to name my workspace? What's the workspace type, for example? What's the workspace description? And I can see that all of these input fields that it is requesting for, it is using this data as a variable. For example, the workspace name is being passed into this request as a variable. The workspace type is being passed as a variable, and the workspace description is being passed as a variable. And all I just need to do is send, right? And I can see that the workspace is created. So now I'm not just reading this documentation and going somewhere else to try out the API. I'm trying out the API in an interactive manner, exactly where I'm learning about the documentation itself. So if I move on, you'd see like the same pattern, for example, and here it's telling me to add a collection to that workspace, and I can see a collection name that I can specify, and a collection in Postman is pretty much just JSON, and this is at a very low level what a collection looks like, and pretty much the same thing. And you can see that the variable it is getting from the previous blocks, I can use that variable the same way I'd get like parameters from a JSON. For example, if I go to the create a workspace block, I can see that this is a JSON, it has a workspace property. The workspace property is an object that has an ID. And I could do create a workspace.workspace.id here to get that specific ID. And on running this, I get a response. I can try to like get the detail of the collection that I just created using the ID of the collection itself. And I'm also referencing like all of this as a variable. So I'm not going to go ahead and show like every single thing in this documentation. What I really want to be the takeaway here is this is a notebook created as an onboarding guide. And it can take any developer from zero to getting that first moment of truth and learning the very basics of the API and really interesting use cases of what the API can do in a much faster way than an actual like documentation would. So it's not replacing the documentation that you already have. The documentation you already have is a complete documentation for your APIs or your platform. But if you're exposing APIs and you want to show very interactive ways where you can tell beautiful stories around the different API use cases and what the APIs can do, notebooks can really help you do that. So let me go ahead and like create like a new notebook from scratch to show you what that example is like. And I'm going to be creating exactly what I have here, but while talking through it. So if you go to postman.com/explore, which is where the Postman Postman API network is, and the Postman API network is just a network of APIs. There's like thousands of publishers that publish their APIs on the Postman API network, and it's a great way to discover new APIs and their documentation and their different artifacts like their open API specification, their collection. And on the public API network, you find that the publishers that are already like verified. So we have like publishers like Shopify, PayPal, Meta, Google, who are publishing their APIs on the public API network. So it's a public repository for different APIs. And I see this create new button here. When I click on create new, you see that there's an option to create a notebook. So I can create a notebook from that. Let's wait for this to load. Okay, great. So now I'm in a blank notebook canvas where really there's nothing here. There's this load from tutorial button that I can use to load a tutorial for notebooks. If I click this, you see that it just loads a tutorial that helps me get started, talks about like the different things in the notebook and what those different things are. But I'm just going to do Ctrl-Z to start from scratch. So the first thing you do in a notebook or with any documentation, tutorial, or blog is maybe come up with a title. It doesn't matter if that's not the final title that we use. So I could come up with some random title here. Or I could just give this the actual title, Getting Started with the Postman API. At this point, I have a lot of Getting Started with the Postman API notebooks because I'd created a lot of it while I was preparing for the session. So if you check the sidebar here, you see a bunch of Getting Started with Postman API. But anyways, the first thing that you need to know is there's the / commands that we have in Notebook, which is really how you populate things. And it also works with like Markdown. So if I do # for example, and I do a space, that's heading 1. If I do # and I do a space, that is heading 2. So your regular Markdown code, which you are used to for writing API documentation, already works within the Notebook experience. And I'm just going to, like I said, what we really want to do is to rebuild this tutorial that I have here. Just so I don't have blank text that looks crazy, I'm just going to copy and paste that, and I'll do # prerequisites. Then maybe just copy the prerequisite code since I don't really care about all of that stuff. But yeah, your regular Markdown works you can do for like lists, everything you can do in Markdown. So this is not a Markdown tutorial, so I'm not going to be showing that. But then there's the / commands, and when you open the / commands, you see like different blocks. Everything in a notebook is a block, and there are 3 blocks. There's the interactive blocks, there's the input block, and there's the basic block. So the basic blocks are the formatting blocks, the things that you can do with an hashtag, and there's like different, with a markdown, not an hashtag, sorry. It's still like, if you want to do it, it's sort of like an hashtag, but in markdown. So there's the basic block, which includes like the different things you can do. You can add an image, you can do a lot of like the text formattings with the basic block. But there's also the input block, which allows you to collect inputs. You can collect a text input, you can collect a number, or you can collect a secret. So for the text input, I can collect something like, what's the name of this API? Or for the secret input, in my case, the first information I asked for in our documentation was the API key, so I could use the secret input. And you find that the difference between the text input and the secret input is that the secret input does not really show you what is there unless you click the eye icon. So I could do API key, and I'm just going to paste my API key from here. And now that I've pasted this API key, what is going to happen is this API key is going to be available as a variable that I can use in other blocks. So if I had another block, for example, I've talked about the inputs blocks, but there's also the interactive blocks, and there are 2 interactive blocks. There's the request block, and there's the code runner block. I mean, notebooks, we try to make sure it has as very few blocks as possible that are functional and have wide range of use cases. Now, the request block is the one I showed you where you used to run a request, but I'll start with the script runner block. And the script runner block really just helps you to run JavaScript code. So for example, in the script runner code block, if I do API key, for example, and I click run, it says reference, API key is not defined. Let me give this a name. I think I needed to give it a name first. That's very interesting. Okay, let me store this as a variable. Sorry, this is JavaScript. Then let me just, or let me console.log this. That's very, this is a classic case of it worked on my machine when I was trying to test, and I'm trying to do the demo, it's not working. Let's go over this again. Let me delete this block. This is API key. And I have the script runner. And I have a test. Oh, it works. It was my mistake. I figured what the issue was. So within a code runner block, the way in which we're exposing the key of previous blocks is not by typing the name of the key. You actually have to declare that as like a variable. So if I come here and I declare a variable and I say const key, I have to use the $sign before the key itself. And using the $sign, you can see that it's already referencing the different things that I have access to. So what I did wrong was I did not include the $sign initially. And instead of a return statement, we sort of have like an implicit return that helps you return something. So you can think of everything within this code runner block as a function with an implicit return. So you don't necessarily have to do return this for it to return that. And it just logs whatever you return from it. And this is probably not a great example. So let me give my collection a name, for example. Let me do another inputs block. And I'd call this the workspace name. And I call this test workspace. So pretty much any JavaScript code that you can write here would work. So I could do workspace name is equal to, I'll do the $sign thing again. Then I could have a random string, and this is just to show that random JavaScript code works here. And I could just do string to return this, and you can see that my workspace name is this. And you could also do things like console.log things for like debugging. So when I run this and I switch to log, you can see that some of the logs are here. But the really cool thing about notebooks is everything in a notebook is available as a variable to be used in another block. So you see that I had the input block here, and I'm using the output of the input block to as a variable in the code runner block. I could similarly use the output of the code runner block as a variable in another block. So let me actually do that. So workspace name, this is a very generic response, but I'll do workspace name plus API so that the workspace name is Postman API. Okay, so, and the collection that this is based off is this particular collection here. So you see that I have this create a workspace request. So there are two things I could do. I could either copy the URL of this particular request from that collection in Postman and paste that URL here and select that specific request, which should have it pop up. Or I could choose to be more granular and just click on info and copy the request ID. Then I could paste that request ID here, and I still get like that same request information. Now, because I have this request here, I'll need to give it a name, create a workspace. You can see that it's requesting for specific information or parameters that it needs to execute that request. And if I go back to my collection here, if I check the request, you'd see that one, I need to provide the base URL. If I go to the request body, you'd see that I need to provide the request body, and I need to provide the name, the type, description, the visibility status, which are the different things that this is requesting for here. So I need to populate all of these things one after the other. But of course, one of the things that you want to do is you want to actively make decisions for people who are reading the notebook. So you don't want them to care about where do I find the base URL or what's the base URL. You can add an input text here that includes the base URL information. And I'm just going to copy that from the previous notebook that I have. So the base URL is already here, which means I can make use of that as a variable. And if I'm making use of that as a variable, we use these double quotes notations for variables within the request block. But because it's an object, you could also do, if it was an object that I had stored as a variable, I could also do base URL dot something something. Then I could do the same thing for the API key. And then for the workspace name, you might want to be proactive. Maybe create like an input field like I did here that maybe create like input fields like I did here that's asking for type the workspace name, type the workspace type, type the workspace description, and you're providing examples of what that would look like. Or you could just write it here as plain text, right? It depends on how what you're trying to communicate to your audience and how proactive you want to be with it. But I always like to use variables because variables keep things dry. You can reuse them across different places. So I always prefer to just use things using like a text box, for example. I could name this type. I could add another text inputs, description, name. I already have the name. Then the last is visibility status. So if I go here, I can see that the workspace type is team. I could give it a name. I could give it a random description. So I'm just going to maintain the same workspace type. I tell you this is a test workspace. And this could be any description to be proactive with what you're giving people. Then for the visibility, I could leave that empty, or I could provide like a visibility. I don't actually need this. So I'm just going to delete that block itself. So now I can provide the workspace name, which I had already defined here. Now you notice that the workspace name here, I have Postman, but for the workspace name, let me name this new workspace name. The name of this block would be what will be available as a variable. So for the workspace name here, let's say I want to return a JSON, for example. And I'm like const name equals to this JSON, and I'm doing the implicit return of name. So now when I want to use this here, I could do workspace name dot name with the dot notation because it is JSON, just to like get the name. And for the type, I already have that declared as a variable. Then I did the same thing for the description. So when I send this request, just to verify that things are working as it should, everything is working the way it should. And this is essentially everything I did here, except that now we are in a demo. I don't want to spend a lot of time on organization and making content look the way it should. But essentially what was done here were the same things I'm doing here while trying to like run this. So this is really useful and helpful, and it's really that's really just it. I mean, if I wanted to like had like a code runner block, for example, this is the last example I want to show. This is a code snippet, but if I wanted to add like a script runner, for example, we have different visualization examples for the snippets where you could visualize something as a bar chart, for example. And you see that that looks really beautiful, and you could just edit that or passing data, or you could visualize something as a donut, then run this. That looks pretty. Or you could do like a complex visualization with React and Tailwind, for example. And this was like the basis for that first example that I did, where it's visualizing something in React. And you can see that this is similar to what I did initially. So they're like templates that help you get started with visualizing things and running like different scripts in the code execution block. But my time is up. So just to talk about, just to highlight like the three different things that we explored. I started from how you move from having your documentation being SEO optimized to being GEO optimized, and how readability is very important, not just to humans, but to machines, and the different agentic systems that are consuming your documentation. And I went to how you can provide a knowledge base for your existing documentation, and I showed an example of an AI agent that I built that helps me get that knowledge base by autonomously perusing the browser, and I can see that that AI agent is probably still, oh, it's done running and it generated a collection. It took 15 minutes, okay. Then we went to showing how you can actually document an interactive experience for your API documentation that developers would actually use using Postman Notebooks. So the last thing here is just that the next generation of developers won't read your documentation alone. Their AI agents will read the documentation with them as well, and the chances that they experience that documentation using an AI agent is perhaps getting by day increasingly higher than it would if they were reading your documentation itself. So we need to optimize for the new class of documentation consumers. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone.